Turkey thought it controlled the Black Sea. It doesn't anymore. For months, Ankara had been playing both sides, selling drones to Ukraine while keeping the Bosphorus open just enough to let Russian ships slip through. Then in March 2026, something changed. Turkey pushed too hard, tested limits it should have left alone, and now Erdogan is scrambling to walk back moves that threaten to turn NATO's second-largest military into Moscow's problem. Not damaged, not strategically repositioned. Turkey's entire Black Sea posture just collapsed in the span of 72 hours. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications because what I'm about to show you is not the story Turkish state media is telling, and it's definitely not what the Kremlin wants you to understand about what just happened in the Black Sea. I'm going to show you exactly how Turkey went from regional powerhouse to strategic liability in less than a week, and why Ankara's sudden reversal tells us more about the future of NATO than anything we've seen since Sweden joined the alliance. We'll cover the specific naval movements that triggered this crisis, the economic pressure that forced Erdogan's hand, and the geopolitical calculation that just reminded Turkey it's not nearly as indispensable as it thinks it is. By the end, you'll understand why this isn't just about the Black Sea. This is about what happens when a NATO member forgets which side of history it's standing on. To understand what just collapsed, you need to understand what Turkey has been doing in the Black Sea since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022. The Montreux Convention, signed in 1936, gives Turkey extraordinary control over the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. During wartime, Turkey can close these straits to warships from non-Black Sea nations. That sounds straightforward until you realize Turkey gets to decide what constitutes wartime, which vessels qualify as warships, and when exceptions apply. Since 2022, Turkey has walked an impossible tightrope. Officially, Ankara closed the straits to military vessels, preventing Russian reinforcements from entering the Black Sea and blocking damaged Russian ships from leaving for repairs. This looked like support for Ukraine and compliance with NATO expectations. But the reality was far more complicated. Turkey allowed what it classified as defensive vessels through. It permitted commercial ships with military cargoes to transit. It granted exceptions for Russian vessels returning to their home ports. The result was a leaky blockade that frustrated both Moscow and Kiev while giving Erdogan maximum diplomatic flexibility. This ambiguity served Turkey's interests perfectly. Ankara sold TB2 Bayraktar drones to Ukraine, earning praise from NATO allies and Ukrainian gratitude. Simultaneously, Turkey maintained economic ties with Russia, refused to join Western sanctions, and positioned itself as the only NATO member still talking to Putin. Turkish construction firms kept working on Russian projects. Russian tourists kept flooding Turkish resorts. Energy deals kept flowing. Erdogan presented himself as the indispensable mediator, the only leader who could bring both sides to the table. But in February 2026, Turkey's calculations shifted. Ukraine's unexpected strike against Iranian drone production facilities, conducted with covert Western backing, fundamentally altered regional dynamics. Iran's ability to supply Russia with Shahed drones collapsed. Russia's most effective long-range strike capability suddenly faced supply constraints it couldn't solve domestically. Moscow needed alternatives, and it needed them immediately. That's where Turkey enters the picture in a new and far more problematic way. Turkish defense companies, particularly Baykar Technology, have spent years developing domestic drone capabilities. The Akıncı combat drone, Turkey's most advanced unmanned system, carries precision-guided munitions and operates at altitudes above most air defense systems. It's not as expendable as a Shahed, but it's far more capable, and Russia wanted them. Intelligence reports indicate that in mid-February, Turkish and Russian officials held quiet discussions about potential defense cooperation. Not just commercial sales, but technology transfer agreements that would allow Russia to manufacture Turkish-designed systems domestically. This crossed every red line NATO had established. Selling drones to Ukraine to fight Russia is one thing. Helping Russia rebuild drone production capacity is something else entirely. Turkey thought it could keep these discussions quiet. It thought wrong. When Ukrainian intelligence intercepted communications about the proposed deals, Kiev immediately shared the information with Washington, London, and Brussels. The reaction was swift and unambiguous. Turkey was not going to arm Russia while claiming NATO membership. Now let's talk about what happened next, because this is where Turkey's strategic miscalculation becomes clear. On March 8, 2026, a Turkish cargo vessel designated as civilian but carrying what maritime tracking identified as military components attempted to transit the Bosphorus northbound toward Russian ports in the Black Sea. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces operating from unmarked vessels in international waters just beyond the Bosphorus exit intercepted the ship, not boarded, not warned, intercepted with precision anti-ship missiles that disabled the vessel's propulsion system without sinking it. The Turkish crew was unharmed, but the message was unmistakable. Ukraine would enforce the blockade that Turkey was allowing to leak. Turkey's response was immediate and furious. Erdogan called it an act of piracy in Turkish waters. The Turkish Navy dispatched 3 frigates to escort the damaged vessel and declared a temporary closure of the straits to all military-related traffic pending security review. Turkish F-16s began aggressive patrols over the Black Sea, locking fire control radar onto Ukrainian drone positions along the coast. For approximately 48 hours, it looked like Turkey might actually engage Ukrainian forces in defense of a Russian-bound cargo. That's when the United States made a phone call that changed everything. According to sources familiar with the conversation, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin contacted Turkish Defense Minister Yaşar Güler with a simple message. Turkey could continue down this path, but it needed to understand the consequences. Those consequences included immediate suspension of F-16 upgrade deliveries Turkey had been waiting years to receive, formal NATO discussions about Article 5 obligations and how Turkey's actions might affect alliance commitments to defend Turkish territory, and targeted financial sanctions that would freeze Turkish defense companies out of Western supply chains they depend on for critical components. But here's what made the call devastating. Austin didn't threaten. He simply stated that these consequences were already in motion unless Turkey reversed course within 72 hours. The F-16 upgrades, worth approximately $23 billion to Turkish defense modernization, were already being pulled from production schedules. NATO ambassadors were already being briefed for emergency consultations. Treasury Department lawyers were already drafting sanction frameworks. Think about what that means for a moment. Turkey wasn't being warned about potential consequences. Turkey was being informed that consequences had already begun and would only stop if Ankara backed down immediately. This is diplomatic pressure at a level Turkey hasn't faced since the 1974 Cyprus crisis. Erdogan had 72 hours to decide whether controlling Black Sea access was worth becoming a strategic pariah. He chose survival over pride. On March 11th, Turkish forces withdrew from their aggressive posture. The frigates returned to port. The F-16 patrols ceased fire control radar locks. Most significantly, Turkey announced new inspection protocols for all vessels transiting the straits, protocols that effectively closed the loopholes Russia had been exploiting. Any vessel carrying military components, regardless of classification, would be turned back. Any vessel registered to companies under Western sanctions would be denied passage. Turkey was implementing the blockade it should have enforced 2 years ago. But there's another dimension to this that deserves attention, because Turkey's reversal wasn't just about American pressure. It was about cold economic calculation that Erdogan couldn't ignore. Turkey's economy is a disaster. Inflation officially runs above 60%, though independent economists put real inflation closer to 100%. The Turkish lira has lost approximately 80% of its value against the dollar since 2018. Foreign currency reserves are critically low. Turkey desperately needs Western investment, international monetary fund support, and access to international capital markets. None of that happens if Turkey becomes a Russian arms supplier while claiming NATO membership. The F-16 deal wasn't just about fighter jets. It represented Turkey's pathway to economic rehabilitation through defense sector integration with Western supply chains. Turkish defense companies employ hundreds of thousands of workers. They generate billions in export revenue. They depend entirely on Western components for radar systems, avionics, weapons integration, and engine technology. Cut Turkey off from those supply chains, and you don't just hurt the defense sector. You trigger cascading unemployment in one of Turkey's few remaining productive industries. Erdogan looked at the math and realized he had no leverage. Russia couldn't replace what Turkey would lose by alienating NATO. Russian investment can't stabilize the lira. Russian technology can't replace American F-16 upgrades. Russian markets can't absorb Turkish exports at the scale Turkey needs. The entire calculation Turkey had been making about playing both sides collapsed when Washington forced Ankara to choose. Now step back and look at what this reveals about NATO's actual power dynamics. because this is where the story gets genuinely interesting from a strategic perspective. For years, analysts have worried about Turkey's drift toward Russia and whether NATO could maintain cohesion with a member that seemed increasingly aligned with Moscow. Turkey blocked Sweden's NATO accession for over a year. Turkey bought Russian S-400 air defense systems despite American objections. Turkey conducted joint military exercises with Russia. The concern was that NATO had no way to discipline a member state that was undermining alliance interests. What just happened in the Black Sea proves that analysis was incomplete. NATO doesn't need formal disciplinary mechanisms when it controls the economic and military integration that members depend on. Turkey's entire defense industrial base is wired into Western systems. Its economy relies on Western financial architecture. Its military operates Western equipment that requires Western maintenance and upgrades. That dependence creates leverage that proves decisive when Washington chooses to use it. The lesson here extends beyond Turkey. Every NATO member that thinks about hedging toward Russia or China needs to understand what just happened. The alliance doesn't need to threaten expulsion or invoke obscure treaty clauses. It just needs to threaten withdrawal of the integration benefits that make membership valuable. For Turkey, that meant F-16 upgrades and supply chain access. For other members, it might mean different pressure points. But the principle is the same. NATO membership creates dependencies that the alliance can weaponize when necessary. This also reveals something important about Ukraine's operational sophistication that often gets overlooked in Western coverage of the conflict. The maritime strike that disabled the Turkish cargo vessel wasn't a desperate act or a tactical error. It was a calculated escalation designed to force Turkey's hand by creating a crisis that required American intervention. Ukraine knew Turkey would respond aggressively. Ukraine also knew that aggressive response would trigger exactly the American pressure that just played out. Think about the intelligence coordination that required. Ukraine needed to know about Turkish-Russian defense discussions. Ukraine needed to identify the specific vessel carrying military components. Ukraine needed to time the strike to maximize diplomatic impact while minimizing risk of actual Turkish-Ukrainian combat. And Ukraine needed to trust that Washington would back the play by pressuring Turkey rather than pressuring Ukraine to de-escalate. That level of coordination suggests intelligence sharing between Ukraine and NATO at a depth that goes far beyond what's publicly acknowledged. Ukraine didn't just get lucky intercepting that vessel. Ukraine was operating with real-time intelligence about Turkish naval movements, cargo manifests, and diplomatic communications. That information came from somewhere, and the most likely source is the same intelligence apparatus that just helped pressure Turkey into backing down. What we're seeing here is Ukraine operating not as a supplicant dependent on Western charity, but as a strategic partner conducting coordinated operations with NATO intelligence services. The strike itself was Ukrainian. The intelligence enabling it was shared. The diplomatic pressure forcing Turkey's reversal was American. But the overall operation was integrated in ways that reveal Ukraine's de facto integration into NATO operational planning long before any formal membership might occur. Now let's address the complexity here, because this isn't a clean story of Turkey learning its lesson and NATO reasserting control. Turkey's reversal is tactical, not strategic. Erdogan backed down because the immediate costs of defying Washington exceeded the benefits of helping Russia, but Turkey's fundamental strategic orientation hasn't changed. Ankara still wants to maintain relationships with Moscow that give it diplomatic flexibility. Turkey still sees itself as a bridge between NATO and Russia rather than as firmly aligned with Western interests. The moment pressure eases, Turkey will likely return to exactly the kind of ambiguous positioning that created this crisis. The economic pressure that forced Turkey's hand also has limits. If Western economies enter recession, or if political changes in Washington reduce American willingness to use economic leverage aggressively, Turkey's calculation might shift again. Erdogan has proven remarkably skilled at surviving crises and waiting out international pressure. 3 months from now, Turkey might be quietly finding new ways to assist Russian logistics while maintaining plausible deniability. There's also a question about whether this approach works with other problematic NATO members. Hungary, for example, has been far more consistently aligned with Russian interests than Turkey, blocking sanctions and opposing military aid to Ukraine. But Hungary's economy is smaller and more integrated into European Union structures, giving Brussels different leverage points than Washington has with Turkey. The F-16 pressure that worked on Ankara wouldn't work on Budapest. which operates Soviet legacy equipment and has different dependencies. And we need to acknowledge that Turkey does have legitimate security concerns that complicate any simple narrative about Erdogan choosing sides. Turkey faces active threats from Kurdish separatist groups that operate from Syrian territory, sometimes with American weapons. Turkey sits next to a collapsing Syria, an unstable Iraq, and an Iranian regime that supports proxies along Turkey's borders. Turkey's relationship with Russia isn't just about economics or Erdogan's authoritarian tendencies. It's about managing threats in a region where Russia remains a critical actor regardless of what's happening in Ukraine. The danger is that NATO's success pressuring Turkey in this instance might create false confidence about the alliance's ability to manage future crises. Turkey backed down because the specific pressure points Washington chose were devastating to Turkish interests. But in a different crisis, with different equities at stake, Turkey might make a different calculation. NATO shouldn't assume that economic leverage will always prove decisive, especially if Erdogan concludes that his political survival requires defying the West, regardless of economic costs. So where does this leave the Black Sea, NATO, and Turkey's role in both? The immediate crisis has passed. Turkey is enforcing tighter controls on Strait transit. Russia's ability to reinforce or resupply Black Sea positions just got significantly harder. Ukraine demonstrated both operational capability and strategic coordination with NATO that strengthens its position as a de facto alliance partner. But the underlying tensions haven't been resolved. Turkey remains a NATO member with interests that don't always align with alliance priorities. Russia remains dependent on Black Sea access for power projection in the Mediterranean and Middle East. Ukraine remains determined to prevent any Turkish backsliding that could help Russian forces. What just happened established new boundaries, at least temporarily. Turkey now knows that playing both sides has limits, and that Washington will use economic pressure when those limits are crossed. Russia knows that its supply routes through Turkey are vulnerable to both Ukrainian interdiction and American diplomatic pressure. Ukraine knows that it can force crises that trigger beneficial NATO intervention, at least when it has solid intelligence and coordinates carefully. The question is whether these lessons stick or whether all three actors will test the boundaries again as soon as circumstances shift. Turkey's history suggests Erdogan will probe for renewed flexibility the moment he thinks Western attention has moved elsewhere. Russia's strategic position demands it keep trying to find ways around the Black Sea blockade. Ukraine's security requires it remain vigilant against any Turkish backsliding that could help Russian logistics. This is not over. What we just witnessed was one round in an ongoing struggle for control of Black Sea access and influence over Turkey's strategic orientation. Ankara backed down because Washington made the costs of defiance immediate and unbearable. But the forces that drove Turkey toward this confrontation haven't disappeared. They've just been temporarily suppressed by economic pressure and diplomatic crisis. The broader lesson here is about NATO's evolution under the pressure of major war in Europe. The alliance is discovering tools for managing member state behavior that go beyond consensus decision-making and diplomatic consultation. Economic integration creates leverage. Defense supply chains create dependencies. That leverage and those dependencies can be weaponized when members threaten alliance interests, even if formal treaty mechanisms don't provide for disciplinary action. Turkey just learned that lesson the hard way. Other NATO members watching this crisis just learned it too. And Russia learned that its ability to exploit divisions within NATO has limits when Washington decides those divisions threaten core alliance interests. The Black Sea remains contested. Turkey remains problematic. But for now, at least, Ankara understands that controlling the straits doesn't mean controlling its own strategic destiny when that destiny conflicts with NATO's fundamental security architecture. Turkey tested limits. Turkey found them. And Turkey backed down because the alternative was strategic isolation it couldn't afford. If you want to understand how power actually works in international relations, beyond treaties and formal mechanisms, watch what just happened to Turkey. That's the real story. That's what States News brings you. Analysis that shows you the leverage, the pressure points, and the calculations that actually determine outcomes when nations collide. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next one.